Amigas y amigos, dear friends, my name is Ignacio Peiró, and I am the director of Instituto Cervantes, London. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this panel, The Oceans 500 Years Later, for which we have gathered two leading scholars in natural sciences, namely Dr. Iris Hendricks and Dr. Jack Middelberg. My first thanks goes to them and also to Chiara Sotis, who will chair the discussion this evening and who is a PhD candidate in environmental economics at the Department of Geography and Environment at the LSE. A big gracias, of course, goes to Fundación Iberdrola, Scottish Power as well, since it is the sponsorship that has made this event possible. And now that I've just mentioned the LSE, please let me show them my gratitude as well, since today's event is a joint initiative launched by both the Instituto Cervantes and our friends from the Cañada Blanch Centre at the LSE and the Fundación Cañada Blanch in Valencia, Spain. In particular, I want to thank his director, the director of the Cañada Blanch Centre at the LSE, Professor Andrés Rodríguez Pose, for his support in what is a new installment of our Rethinking the World Today talk series. In this panel this evening, we would like to reflect on the evolution of our oceans, taking as a starting point the exploration age 500 years ago, to make a comparison with the current conditions and the destruction the oceans have suffered since the times Spanish and Portuguese sailors like Elcano and Magellan made their discoveries. We will also consider the work of science and the value of understanding history as a weapon to be used in the conservation of our planet. Topics such as the threats to marine biodiversity will be discussed, including the adverse effects we see on health and in the changing climate due to the effects of human action on the environment. The importance of well-planned waste management will be considered as well, and the physical, chemical, biological, and geological effects that explain the current state of the oceans will be reviewed. Today's discussion will also highlight the tools available and the urgent need for crucial actions that must be taken, such as the creation of an adequate international network of marine reserves, which will allow future generations to enjoy the oceans much as we have been doing in this half millennium. I will now leave the floor to Jan Aitken from Fundación Iberdrola, Scottish Power, but first, let me briefly introduce our speakers today. Iris Hendricks has a degree in marine biology and a PhD in mathematics and natural sciences from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She is currently based in Spain, where she is part of the Mediterranean Institute for Advanced Studies, which, if I'm not mistaken, is based in Palma in Mallorca. And as for Jack Middelberg, he is head of the Department of Geosciences and Earth Sciences at Utrecht University. In 2020, Middelberg has been recognized as a member of the European Academy of Sciences. This is all from me, ladies and gentlemen. I will briefly come back in order to leave the floor to the speakers. I hope you will enjoy the panel, and please feel free to take part during the Q&A. At the end of it, you can type your questions in the chat. Muchas gracias.
Many thanks, Ignacio. I'm delighted to be here today to attend to tell you about the Iberdrola Foundation. My name is Jan Aitken. I work for the Scottish Power Foundation, and I'm excited to tell you about our new Marine Biodiversity Fund, which we launched a few days ago, a few days before COP. So Iberdrola is a global energy leader, the #1 producer of wind power and one of the world's biggest electricity utilities. Our activities are mainly concentrated in 5 geographical areas: Spain, the United Kingdom, United States, Mexico, and Brazil. From the Iberdrola Group, we produce and supply electricity to around 100 million people worldwide. Since the Iberdrola Group was established, it's been committed to the energy, cultural, and social development of the communities in which it operates. The work of the different foundations, in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is essential to fulfill this commitment. The Scottish Power Foundation was set up as a registered charity in 2013 to demonstrate its own commitment to supporting its communities in the United Kingdom, and is one of the 5 foundations within the Iberdrola Group. So what do we do at the Scottish Power Foundation? We provide funding each year to registered charities in the UK that support one of our strategic aims. The strategic aims are education, training and research, art and culture, social initiatives, and biodiversity and climate change. And in this category, it's about supporting the protection of the environment, increasing biodiversity, and actively contributing to the fight against climate change. We are very proud in the Scottish Power Foundation that since 2013, more than 200 projects across the UK have benefited from funding in grants totaling almost £10 million. So you can see that climate and biodiversity were already one of the 4 strategic aims of the Foundation. And given that the next decade of climate action will be crucial for the health of our seas and oceans, we were keen to do more in this field of marine biodiversity. And so we were delighted to receive an additional 400,000 in funding for a new marine biodiversity fund. This is the first multi-year fund for the Foundation, and Scottish Power have committed a further donation in 2022, meaning that we will be able to fund a marine biodiversity project for up to 600,000 over the next 3 years. We designed our criteria for this new fund following discussions and consultation with environmental experts within the Iberdrola business. And we were clear that the project should have 2 focuses. One, it should contribute to the protection and the enhancement of the marine environment, protecting and enabling the repair of this environment. And the project should also share knowledge with other project partners within the local community and wider society to raise awareness of the threats to the marine and coastal environment. We received 16 applications for this new fund, and a few trends stood out in the applications around national marine parks, citizen science, species protection, and restoration. But overwhelmingly, the trustees voted in support of one particular project that will drive a plan to simultaneously restore 2 marine species back in the Firth of Forth near Edinburgh in Scotland. The Scottish Power Foundation has awarded its first grant from the Marine Fund to WWF's Restoration Forth project. So what will Restoration Forth do for the marine environment? The project will work in partnership with scientists, charities, and local communities to design a blueprint to restore and sustainably manage seagrass and oyster habitats in the Firth of Forth. Often described as the ocean's unsung hero, seagrass provides important habitat for marine life and is an incredible tool in the fight against climate change. Oyster reefs, which first flourished in the Forth many years ago, remove pollutants and provide a sanctuary for a vast array of marine life. The restoration of these 2 species will enhance the marine environment of the Forth, support nature-based solutions to address climate change, and create opportunities for local people to reconnect with the sea. Restoration Forth will put the community at the heart of its project, with local people consulted throughout the project and a focus on developing skills and knowledge in the marine environment. A thriving marine environment is crucial if we are to tackle biodiversity and the climate crisis that we face, and this project will help us make a positive impact and create a climate legacy for many years to come. I would like to show you a very short video to explain more about the project.
We're here today on the banks of the River Forth to launch a project called Restoration Forth, which the Scottish Power Foundation is funding from its Marine Biodiversity Fund. Restoration Forth is a multi-partner project. The main partner we're going to be working with is WWF, and we're delighted to be working with them. But it's also going to involve a range of other community groups and local charities up and down the banks of the Forth.
WWF is super excited about this project and really proud of what we can hopefully achieve here, and so grateful to the Scottish Power Foundation for providing funding to kick it off. There's a lot of work that goes into this before we can get to the stage of getting oysters and seagrass out into the Firth of Forth. So we'll be working with Harriet Watt and a range of specialists to grow up native oysters to the point where we can get them out into the sea. And also working with Project Seagrass, who's developed a method for getting seagrass out there using these small Hessian sacks where you put seeds in and essentially plant them out as if you're gardening, but in the sea.
As trustees of the foundation, we get to look at lots of amazing projects, but we have to make quite hard decisions to think which ones will be the most important to support.
In the run-up to COP26, it's amazing to be here on the Firth of Forth to support this project that's going to have a really significant impact both on climate change, on the ecology and the restoration of this particular area, and perhaps more importantly on the local communities who are going to be really heavily involved in the project.
I'm immensely proud to be part of the Scottish Power Foundation and to have the opportunity to be able to fund projects like Restoration Forth. The climate emergency is on everybody's lips, particularly after lockdown. We're in our own localities, people are much more engaged in the conversation, and it's brilliant for foundations like the Scottish Power Foundation to be able to fund the necessary research that we will all benefit from in our local environments going forward.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to come and tell you about the foundation and our work in the marine biodiversity space. I wish you a very informative and enjoyable evening. Thank you, Ignacio.
Thank you very much, Jan, for showing us the amazing work that the Scottish Power Foundation is undertaken. Since 2013. And now, without further ado, please, I will leave the floor now to Chiara Sotis and, of course, Iris Hendricks and Jack Middleborough. And, well, that's all from me. I do hope that you enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you to everyone who put together the event. I'm really excited to be a part of it. I think we're in for a very interesting evening where we'll talk about different topics throughout the talks from Iris and Professor Jack Middleburg. They need no introduction. They're incredibly prolific scholars, and they're writing a lot about climate change and how it's affecting our oceans. So they definitely don't need me to introduce them. I'm looking forward to actually hearing them talk and to potentially have a discussion with them at the end. But I really invite you to make the most of this occasion to write questions and start the discussion yourselves, so that we're only here to support it. And without further ado, I think, Iris, you're our first speaker, so I'm going to leave the floor to you. And then we're going to have Jack coming in and talking to us about the history of our oceans, the threats that it faces, and possibly the hopes for going on.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Ignacio. And I'm very happy to, well, be here in the virtual space to talk about this. I think it's a very important series, the reflection of what is happening with the oceans. So I'll see if I can share my screen. So can you see the presentation at the moment?
Yes, we can see the presentation and your notes series.
Okay, so let me see if this is better. Is this better? Can you see the screen now and not the notes?
No, we still see everything.
That's funny. I don't know why. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, like Perfect. This. Okay, too much technology. Okay, so sorry for that. Let me start without further ado. So when we think about the oceans 500 years ago, what did we know about the oceans? What we knew about the planet Earth is that it was, well, more or less the suspicion was that it was round and at the center of the universe. but the dimensions of the planet were unknown, and navigation techniques, they were very crude still. So the picture I've shown here is an astrolabe, which is it's a mechanism in which you determine what latitude you're navigating. But it was very difficult for sailors to know where they were. So it was very precarious to actually go explore what was out there. So that the planet was round was demonstrated by the first circumnavigation expedition started by Fernando de Magalhães, who was Portuguese, but actually sponsored by the Spanish crown. And he wasn't able to finish the circumnavigation, but Joan Sebastián Elcano was. And with this circumnavigation in the early 1500s, they demonstrated that the Earth was round. And since the Earth is round, this offered a lot of possibilities for global trade because it enhanced the connectivity between places. So, and with global trade again, and global commerce, also came a little bit before the era which is also called the Columbian Exchange. It's an era a little bit more than 500 years ago, in which we humans started exploring the ocean and exploring other sites and trading between the continents. So this is a map of the voyages of Christopher Columbus, sponsored by the Reyes Católicos, a little more than 500 years ago, in which he undertook the journey from Europe to the Americas to discover and to trade. So with this trade, not only commercial goods and persons were transported, but also marine animals. So for instance, they demonstrated that the soft shell clam, Mia arenaria, was reintroduced more or less between 400 and 700 years ago in Atlantic Europe. So the species was present before, but was not present at that moment. So this is a reintroduction, and this definitely must have had something to do with the increased movements of ships between Europe and the Americas. So there were lots of unwanted passengers also on board of these ships. So if I say introduced, what does it actually mean? Introduced is a word that we also use other type of words: exotic species, alien species, non-native species. It's a species that is not native to a region and has arrived with human existence. So that might be deliberate or accidental in the case of ship movements of Columbus. So when is a species native? It's native if it actually has evolved in the region where it's present or elsewhere, but arrived by its own means. So usually that happened a long time ago, and a way this could have happened, for instance, is by larval dispersion. So bivalves, like the clam I just talked about, they have pelagic larvae, which even if they are sessile, which means that they're attached in one site and they don't move during their adult life, they can move and expand the range through the pelagic larvae, which are transported by the current. So a transport like this is still a species within its native range, and to be introduced, there is actually a human factor involved. So what is a factor? A factor is a means of transport by which a species is transferred to another location, and usually this is hundreds or thousands of kilometers. And this can be deliberate or not deliberate, unintentional or deliberate. So before Columbus, there were already a lot of this kind of factors. And here I'm obviously talking about the wooden hull of ships. For instance, the Chinese in Asia and even the Vikings could have been able to transport marine organisms. And actually the uncertainty date on the introduction of the soft shell clam might also pinpoint at the Vikings at already a vector for introduction of this species. So like you can see on the picture on the upper left-hand side here, this kind of transport would be by the wooden hull. And one of the very famous examples of this type of transport is also the shipworm, which was a big danger for because it can destroy the ships. And this is actually not a worm. It's even if the name is shipworm, it's a bivalve, and it's a wood-boring bivalve. So in the more in the current area, we don't use wooden ships so much, but we can still have a lot of growth of marine life on the hulls of ships, like you can see in the picture on the left-hand side below. So that can be algae that grow on the hull or on the helis of the ships, and this actually can slow down a ship a lot. So this does cost money to commercial shipping companies. So a way around this is using anti-fouling paint. So nothing can grow on the hull, but this is actually not very good for the environment. But not only growth on the hull can be effective for transport, also the ballast water. So if ships, if commercial ships are full, they are much lower in the water. And if they unload their commercial goods, then actually they're very high up in the water. So what a ship does, if it has to go empty between two harbors, is that it takes in ballast water. So it's a little bit lower in the water column, and it releases this ballast water upon arriving to another harbor. And with this ballast water, pelagic larvae, I just told you that bivalves have pelagic larvae, for instance, but there are also organisms that spend their whole life in the water column, like the comb jelly, for instance, which is also a very famous introduced species. They can travel in this water and arrive to another harbor. So due to the increase in maritime traffic that we have seen in the last year, because of increasing global trade, these factors, these transport routes and the possibilities for species to arrive from one side to another have also increased. And we have also opened connections that weren't there before geographically, like for instance, the Suez Canal. And as you might remember, not so long ago, the Suez Canal was blocked by a ship, and this caused a big disruption in global trade. So actually, trade by ships is a very important route and a very important factor. And what we can see in the future with global warming is that there might be even new trade routes. So we're actually opening up new routes. For instance, if the Arctic would be ice-free, this would be a very fast route between sites that are now much further apart. And what we have seen since the 1979 is that the extension of sea ice in the Arctic is going down, has decreased with around 40%. So it is quite possible, even though I think at the moment there's some Russian ships stuck in the Arctic ice. So it's not a very trustworthy route at the moment, but it might be in the future. And this might also increase the ship movements through new routes. So if we look at the connections between sites, we see that the world nowadays is very connected by marine traffic. So this is an important factor for marine organisms to be introduced to new sites, but not only by ships, they can be introduced, they can also be introduced by deliberate or maybe not so deliberate introductions, like for instance, aquaculture. The Japanese oyster was introduced in Europe as a food source, a commercial food source, and they thought that it wouldn't be able to reproduce because the temperatures were too low. But not only did it reproduce, it actually colonized the estuaries, like for instance in Holland, like you can see on this picture, and it's a bit of a nuisance species at the moment. So that was a deliberate introduction that wasn't so deliberate in its actual final dispersion. There's also deliberate introduction of ornamental species, like for instance the lionfish and some algae for aquaria, like here the Calerpa taxifolia, who are not introduced to the marine habitat maybe deliberately, but are transported. And in the case of the ornamental alga, it allegedly escaped from the aquarium in Monaco and that way established in the Mediterranean Sea. So when we look at the graph to the right-hand side, we can see that the number of introductions, the number of non-native species that are moved to another site have increased markedly over the last years. And if we look at the importance, the relative importance of the vectors, we can see that, for instance, on the left-hand side, you can see the vectors of introduction of seaweeds worldwide. You can see that hull fouling is a very important factor, as well as shellfish farming and aquaculture and ballast water. But that there's also a lot of unknowns. So the biggest introduction, the biggest number of introductions, we actually don't know how the seaweeds arrived at the new site. So if we look at the Mediterranean, which is it's like a very small sea, so it's easier to study because of its limited area. We can see that in the Mediterranean, the most important factor is the Canal of Suez, which is recently enlarged. So this will only increase in importance, as well as vessel movement, which is marine traffic and aquaculture. So when we stay at the Mediterranean, which I said is like, since it's a limited geographic area, it's easier to study processes. Sometimes it's like a model, a little model sea. So what we see in the Mediterranean, if we look at the number of introduced species, so more introduced species would relate to a more red color, more warm color. So we see that most of the introduced species are actually very close to the Suez Canal. So if this is their entry points, that does make sense. But what we also see is that the origin logically would be the Red Sea. The Red Sea is a tropical sea, while the Mediterranean is temperate. So there's a big temperature difference between these two regions. But if we look at the mean surface temperature in the Mediterranean Sea, we also see that the warmest temperatures can be observed in the southern part of the Mediterranean Sea. So not only is the southern part, the southeastern part of the Mediterranean closer to the Suez Canal, it's also warmer. So the temperature in this area is closer to the temperature at the origin of the species. And is this important? Yes, it is important, because a species would be more successful to settle in an area which is resembles the origin of the species. So what can we expect in the future? Here on the left-hand side in this graph, you can see that the temperatures of the surface water globally are increasing. And if you look at the right-hand side, this is actually not, this is a figure in which you can see the rate of increase. So what we see is that the sea surface water has been warming in the Mediterranean, but it hasn't been warming homogeneously. So it has the rate of warming is much faster in the southeastern part than in the northwestern part. So this means that this area wasn't only warmer already, it will be even warmer than the other part of the Mediterranean. So the regional differences. So this introduced species, to remind you again, introduced species is a species that is not native to a region and has arrived with human assistance, while a native species can arrive to a region through a range expansion, which is like natural transport. So the problem here is this, in definitions, the global warming is it if a native species expands in range because the site is warm enough for it, while it wasn't before. Is this still a native species, or are we actually talking about an introduced species here? So I've been talking about ranges. A range is the geographical area in which a species can be found. So a range expansion is an increment in the area where a species can live, can establish. And why can a species establish in certain areas and not in others? Because every species has a niche, and a niche is the match of the species demands to a specific environmental condition. So for instance, if a tropical species needs warm water, while an Arctic species needs a much colder temperature. So they have different niches. Not only temperature determines where species can live, also, for instance, humidity, oxygen availability, light, salinity, density of the water. And here we can think about the deep sea and pH. So as an example of a niche and the difference between theoretical demands of a species and actual realized niches, here we see an example of barnacles. So here are two species of barnacles, and in the right-hand side, you can see that their fundamental niche, so the place where they could live, has a big overlap. And then the realized niche is actually different because of a competition between these species. So this is also important. If a new species arrives that has the same niche as a native species, it might be able to outcompete the other species, and that might be a problem. So do we expect to see a lot of rain shift? Yes, because of global warming, the global temperature is rising. So that also means that the species, even if it stays at the same place where it always was, it will experience different environmental parameters, and therefore it might have to move to stay within its niche. So why is this a challenge? Well, for instance, this is a challenge if we talk about the species that is present in a mountain, because since at higher altitudes, the temperatures are cooler. So you could say, why doesn't the species just move up? So that means that the higher niche, so on the top of the mountain, the species won't have a place to go to. And also the oxygen availability decreases when you go up. So it isn't only the temperature that will be in the right condition for the animal. It might be that another environmental parameter like oxygen is not. So the same for the deep sea. Even if the surface warms up in the deep sea, it might still be the right temperature for a species, but migrating to a deeper site means also having to deal with the pressure at that site. And for instance, in the sea, in a marine environment, for instance, a species might be able to move from a lower latitude to a higher latitude, but even if this dispersal is possible, the light availability at higher latitudes is not the same, because in summer there's more light available, but in winter there is less availability of light. And ocean acidification, which Jack will talk about, also increases at higher latitude. So it might be that this is not an option for those species. And here we can see a possibility of a climate-induced rain shift for this kelp, laminaria. Since the temperatures will warm up, it might be that the southern range of the species is not, these sites won't be suitable anymore because the temperatures will be too high, and it can move into higher latitudes. So this is what we can expect. But not for the Mediterranean because it has a geographical boundary. So in the end, for species in these changing times, it's usually not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. So this is, I think, a clue for not only for species but also for us humans. So. That is it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hear from Jack.
Thank you, Iris, and thank you so much for keeping to time. This is a really nice overview of the topics that we want to go through today. And as you anticipated, Jack is going to talk more about ocean acidification and what we need to be doing. So let me give the floor to him directly so that he can start his presentation.
Good afternoon, good evening all. I'm now first going to share my screen, and I hope I have the right one right now. Is this the right one?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So tonight I'm going to focus on carbon in the ocean. So basically the idea that I will speak about what does the ocean provide as a service to us, which is not directly biology, but more physics and chemistry. I'm not going to talk about physics, but just one example. If you look at global warming, more than 95% of all the heat is going into the ocean. If that would not be the case, the winter temperature in London would be like the summer temperature in Siberia. So our world would be inhabitable hot without the ocean taking all the additional heat. So the second service of the ocean is that the ocean takes up a lot of the carbon dioxide which we emit, and I'm going to communicate to you, say, the global carbon cycle and the role of the ocean and how that causes acidification of the ocean. So before that, I want to introduce two visionary scientists. First, at the end of the 19th century, a world-famous chemist from Sweden, Svante Arrhenius, he already published in 1896 on the influence of carbonic acid in the air upon the temperature on the ground. So basically, the potential impact of gases like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on the temperature is already known for more than 125 years. Then, in 1956, that was the International Geophysical Year, like we now have the Decade of the Ocean. This was at that time the International Geophysical Year. There were two scientists in the US, Roger Revelle and Hans Suess. They wrote an article where they basically said, okay, there is an increase in atmospheric CO2 because of fossil fuel release, which we believe is very small at present, but it may become significant during the future decades and may cause additional warming of our climate. So what they did is they hired a young PhD student, Charles Keeling, which you see there, which was this person. He got charged by doing something which at that time people thought that's not possible. Measuring the accumulation of fossil fuel-derived carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So he started, say, in the geophysical year, at the end is in 57, and then after 2-3 years, he already saw that the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and these are numbers are 311 to 313 about, that means 300 molecules out of the 1 million molecules are CO2. He saw that there was an increase. Now, this stimulated lots of research, and now we have, at many places on the world, we have a systematic measurement of the carbon dioxide, like here at the station Mauna Loa, Hawaii, with the years, and you see a steady increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which ultimately is the cause of global warming and also of changes in the ocean chemistry. So before I'm going to show some data, just something about the units. In global change research, we always talk about 1 petagram or 1 gigaton, which is exactly the same. That's 10 to the power 15 grams. So most people don't have no feeling at all with 10 to the power 15 grams. That's about all the fishes which are presently in the ocean. Gives you some idea about how much that is. It is about 25% of all the food we as humans are consuming. And it is about 10% of all our carbon emission, as you will see in the next sheet. So to go more to which might be more sensible for you is how many Olympic swimming pools would fit in 1 petagram, and an Olympic swimming pool is 50 meters. It's about 400,000 Olympic swimming pools. That's 1 gigaton if you put it into grams of water. So that's a very large amount. And then what is the problem with our present day carbon cycle? So for the last decade, we have seen that there are 2 sources of additional carbon to the atmosphere. One is land use change. We are cutting trees so that we can put soya cultivation, which we can then import to feed our livestock in North America and Europe and other places. which is releasing about 1.6 petagram carbon per year. This deforestation, the changes in the carbon stock related to it. By far the major source of anthropogenic carbon dioxide is fossil fuel release, and there is a little contribution of lime production, cement production. Now, so this is about 11 petagram carbon per year. So 11 times 400,000 Olympic swimming pools per year out of carbon we are emitting to the atmosphere. What is happening with it? Now, about 47% is staying in the atmosphere. That's what the picture I showed, that the increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide are measured, and they are steadily increasing. That's 47% of what we as human add to the atmosphere. The other 53 is going to the land biosphere, so to all the forest and the ocean in similar quantities. The absolute amount and the relative amount varies a little bit, but usually we say that similar amount goes to the land biosphere and to the ocean. So why is the land biosphere taking up more CO2? That's because of, say, greenhouse effect. Not the greenhouse effect in warming, but plants and trees, they use carbon dioxide as a substrate to produce new leaves, new stems. And if you have more CO2 in the atmosphere, they grow faster, provided other things are there. I'm going to focus on this part, the oceans. So the oceans not only take up 95% and more of the heat, but also 25% of the carbon which we as humans are emitting. So if you look at it, so 47% of the human carbon remains in the atmosphere. About 25 goes into the ocean. So far, everything which we have emitted from the very beginning as humankind, 31 has accumulated in the ocean. And of course, there are no free lunches, neither in Earth system science. So the ocean takes up this additional carbon dioxide, but it comes at a price, and that's ocean acidification. And we call ocean acidification the other CO2 problem. The first CO2 problem is, of course, global warming. The other CO2 problem is ocean acidification. Just for your imagination, the ocean contains about 44 times more carbon than there is in the atmosphere. So the ocean carbon is really, really important. So why is there so much carbon in the ocean? Now, the first thing is, of course, that the ocean has a very large surface area and is very deep. So you can easily take up a little bit out of the atmosphere, and it doesn't change the ocean a lot. But the other reason is the following. CO2. This is the sea-air interface. This is the air. There is CO2 in the atmosphere, which goes into the ocean. And in the ocean, this CO2, which we as chemists write as with a CO with a subscript, reacts with water. You form carbonic acid. So what is basically the water which you can also order in a restaurant if you want to have water with CO2. And this is a weak acid, and this weak acid, you might recall from chemistry, is something which wants to get rid of its proton, and then you get an anion and the bicarbonate, a weak acid, a weak base as the other ion. So what is then the case? What we have is that carbon dioxide, a gas enters the waters, it forms a weak acid, which then results in the liberation of protons, which is an acid-generating substance, and bicarbonate or hydrogen carbonate and carbonate, which are anions. So, and those anions cannot leave the seawater anymore, with the net effect that of the 20 molecules of CO2 entering seawater, 19 are trapped in the form of those ions, and there is also some proton release. So the protons accumulate in the ocean, and that's what we call ocean acidification. So as a scientist, you have various tools to to understand nature. One of them is to make observations. Another one is to develop theory and use that theory to make predictions. And one of the well-established fields in science is thermodynamics, which is at the interface of physics and chemistry. And this thermodynamics has been used to make prediction about what would be the evolution of pH and the increase in carbon in the ocean given the atmospheric CO2 increase. Now, what we have done as oceanographers, we have measured at the ocean time series stations, so at the multiple places at the ocean, like Hawaii Ocean Time Series stations, Bermuda Atlantic Time Series station. Then we have Esta, which is the Spanish station, and then the Iceland Sea station. We have measured the pH in red and accumulation of carbon dioxide in blue. And you can see that precisely what we predict theoretically is observed, that the pH, which is the acidity, is increasing or the pH is declining. So we see that observations are fully consistent with theory, which has been developed a century ago. So that means that this is solid research. So here we have some more stations which you find in the ocean, and you can see there is one Spanish station that's on the Canary Islands, that's called Esta, and that's one of the long-term observation stations. It was started by Spanish scientists, and it is now one of the European long-term observation stations. So what is a pH? For those who might recall it from high school, that is the minus logarithm out of the proton concentration. For the rest, it is important, there's a measure of acidity. The lower, the more acid it is. But do realize the ocean is still alkaline. The pH is about 8, so it is not acid. And also do realize a logarithm unit means that if you have a 0.3 units change, it means a doubling of the protons. So acidification, so what? Why should we be interested? I'm going just to show 3 impacts of ocean acidification. Many organisms in the ocean produce calcium carbonate, skeletons, frames, etc. We have tropical corals, we have deep sea water corals. The relative distribution is very similar in the ocean. This is what we all know. This has been discovered the last 25 years. And of course, you have different bivalves, including the cockles, which I guess most of you are familiar with from the nice dishes you have in Spain. So one of the big issues is with ocean acidification is that calcification declines. So here we have different calcifying groups, calcifying algae, corals, cockolites, which are small plants, algae, which float into the water, which produce calcium carbonate skeleton, and eventually they can produce lots of carbonates, which are basically the cliffs of Dover are made out of this carbonate from those little tiny organisms. And then you also have the mollusk. What people have done is they have done lots of studies, and then they looked at the overall effect of all those studies. We call it the meta-analysis, which is coming out of medical sciences. And basically, if something is red or pinkish, it means that it has a negative impact. So ocean acidification certainly has a negative impact of many aspects of calcifiers. Of course, there are always winners and losers. So ocean acidification is, if you're looking at fleshly algae, sea grasses or diatoms, which are one of the group of phytoplankton in the ocean, you see that they profit from it because they are green. And that's logical. That's the same as what you see in the forest on land. If you have more carbon dioxide available, those plants will grow faster. But there are many, many more effects of ocean acidification, too many to discuss and communicate to you. But one which is quite esoteric, might be interesting, and you might recall even more than the other things, is that ocean acidification, for what you can see here, the change in pH, and we expect that depending on how we are following the Paris Agreement or not, we will get a pH decline at the end of the century from -0.2 to -0.6. And here we have the frequency of sound. And those lines give the amount of attenuation, how much the attenuation is less in the ocean. And you see that if we get a pH decline of about 0.4, or we see that about we lose about 50% of the attenuation of sound, meaning that the ocean is getting more noisier. Now, at this low frequency, that's the sound, so that's the frequency that is used for communication among mammals. So it means that those organisms are going to get in completely different environments in terms of the sounds they can hear. So, a picture can tell it much better than for many of us than a scientific graph. So I show the effect of carbon dioxide on two ecosystems, a Mediterranean ecosystem and a tropical coral reef. At some places at the seafloor, we have seeps. Those are very localized places, by the way. You have seeps which are where you have escape of CO2-rich gases and water, which are coming ultimately from volcanism. And nearby you have normal conditions. So in the Mediterranean, we see here the normal Mediterranean with nice seagrasses, some shells. And here we see very nearby, there was a localized CO2 release, and you see that this is detrimental for the shells, but the seagrasses are doing well. The same thing if you're going to look at this tropical coral reef system, there were also carbon dioxide rich seeps, and you see that at a pH of 8.1, which is the normal, you have a very nice coral reef where we really would like to dive and snorkel. But if the pH is going down to levels what we expect by the end of this century, it doesn't look very well. Now, to be really blunt, this is not the biggest problem with coral reefs, the CO2. I think the biggest problem are the marine heat waves, which are causing that they get a temperature shock and their symbionts will die. Okay, so then we as scientists should not only look at issues, identify issues, we should also think about, can we do something about it? Yes, there are a few things that we can do about it, which we call ocean solutions. One of them is to add either some finely grinded basalt rocks, olivine, or we add some lime, which we can do, either we can directly add it to the sea, or we can add it to our agricultural soil, and then it is, some of the products are transported to the sea, and then we increase the alkalinity, which is basically a scientific word for the amount of base, and then we counter effect ocean acidification, and even more important, we are going to enhance the uptake of CO2 by the ocean. Is this the only solution? There is a whole booming area of climate solution, including ocean solutions, where scientists try to use all their knowledge and creativity to find ways to contribute to the diminishing of carbon dioxide issues. One way to do this, and that's something which we really have to go to if we want to reach the 1.5 and 2 degrees warming targets, is to go for what we call carbon dioxide removal options or negative emissions. And those always include that you take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then store it somewhere permanently. Now, there are a few options. One of them is the coastal blue carbon, that's this one, which basically means that we're going to stimulate the growth of seagrass meadows, mangroves, salt marshes, because they capture a lot of carbon, and they also have a lot of additional benefits like nature conservation, coastal defense, etc. And you see that this is a really very good climate solution, not only for the climate, but for lots of other things. By the way, these are all the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, so there are no negative impacts, but the amount of carbon which we can capture with those coastal, what we call blue carbon system, is very, very limited because the coastline is only a very small part of the ocean and of our globe. The other way to do this is to do ocean alkalinity enhancement, which I was just showing in the previous graph. That's something which has been tested in models in the lab, a few field experiments, but basically what we see here, it has no negative things, but we simply do not know whether there are benefits or not. So with this, I would like to end my contribution to today's presentation. Let's see here. And I would like to give the floor back to Jara for the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jack. And again, thank you for keeping to time. This is really impressive. Economists would have never done this. So I hand it over to you. You've both been great at this. So we have no questions in the chat, and I have about an encyclopedia full of questions for you and Iris. So I'm going to get us started, but I invite everyone else to use the chat so that they can ask questions as well. And I'm going to get us started on a provocatory note, because COP26 is just over, and you had to see this coming from an economist, I guess. You know, we've seen the health of our ocean being a key to the sustainable development goals that the UN is facing. And we see politicians more and more saying that the ocean economy is a very important part of our economy. In fact, the OECD has an ocean economy page. Really brilliant data on the presence of fish and, you know, how many ships are in the sea and what are we fishing, what are we doing with it? And we know that there's some efforts on species restoration, on coral reefs restoration as well, some of it going on in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef. Are we doing enough? Are we heading in the right direction, or is there still a very large gap between where we are, where we're heading, but mostly where we should be going?
Yeah. You wish you start?
Yes, I'll start. You can finish, because I'm sure you have a lot to say about this. So I think it's important not to be negative, because if you're negative and you say it's too late, we're not doing enough, that doesn't actually stimulate people to really put in an effort. I think it's never too late to do something. Are we doing enough at the moment? I'd say no, really. But yeah. One of the problems, I think, is that we're not using the possibilities that are offered enough. And there's this lag in knowledge and implementation. And I think Jack has more profound things to say as well.
Yeah, okay, yes. So are we doing enough? No, because there is a pressing problem. Should we be pessimistic? No, because of the pressure from society and the recognition that we only have about 11-12 years to go till we have really passed the 1.5 if we continue like this. We are realizing that we have to go towards carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, and the ocean plays a major role. We can do it with nature-based solutions, which I will show you, but probably one of the major roles is that the ocean offers lots of space for solar and wind energy, which means that we have to rely less on fossil fuel. And also, if any of the carbon capture technology, which we have to include, if we want to go to carbon neutral, say 2040, 2050, we have to develop technologies to capture carbon dioxide and to store it somewhere. And the place to store, one of the options is, of course, in all the old reservoir for gas and oil, which the technology is there. The energy companies, formerly called oil and gas companies, have the technology, have the infrastructure, etc. There is, of course, the human dimension that it will likely not happen a lot on land, because in many of the countries, certainly in Europe, most of the countries will the people will oppose that CO2 will be stored below ground on land, but we can do it at sea. So there is a lot of positive energy. It's creating a lot of new players are coming on the market. For instance, just a few months ago, I saw that Google has now a carbon modeling group in the ocean because they want to explore what are the possibilities, because everybody sees that there is a pressing need that we do something about it. And also you see that natural scientists, which used to be what some people call in the ivory tower and don't looking at all the other aspects, from the very beginning you see now consortia where law people, economic people, ethics people, everybody's involved to look for climate solutions which are acceptable for everywhere and by everybody, so that we can really go for solutions. So I'm optimistic, but we have to do something.
That's great. So we have the first set of questions from the audience. I'm going to read them out to you, and I think most of them are actually to both of you. So let's start with the first, thinking about lime added to the sea to change the pH of it. Is this dependent on the depth and the temperature of the places where we're adding it, or what is it dependent on?
Okay, so the figures I showed, there were those, you saw that the pH was going down with some fluctuations. Those fluctuations are there because if you measure at a certain location in the ocean, the currents are changing, there is the weather pattern, the seasonality is always different, so you see those things. And the line was just a statistical technique called linear regression, which gives the long-term trend.
Great. So let's maybe take a couple more questions. Professor Rodriguez-Poza is asking to Jack, but also to Iris. Jack mentioned that global warming and ocean acidification are the twin challenges linked to increased CO2 emissions. Are they complementary? Do they reinforce each other?
Okay, that's probably one for me.
Yes.
So the global warming and the CO2, they both have the impact on the ocean. And they have, for instance, if you get global warming, you're changing the circulation pattern in the ocean. And for that reason, you also change the carbon dioxide uptake by the ocean. If you have warming of seawater, you change the carbon chemistry of the ocean. Basically, if you make it warmer, you change the solubility of CO2 in the ocean, which again has consequences for the carbon dioxide uptake. So those two things are interacting, which also makes it very complex. And then I'm not talking at all about the biological effects, which living organisms are affected both by temperature and CO2. And that's another story again. So that's why it is not easy to do this type of research.
All right, let's proceed to the next question. And I think Iris, this time it can be on you. So Antonio tells us, I have read that we have impacted negatively the size spectrum of species in the sea. How do we think that recovery of these could help in general to the healing of our oceans?
So the decrease in size in the species in the sea is mainly due to, when we talk about fish populations, for instance, is due to fishery and over-exploitation of these resources. So how can we help recovery? Fishing less, I would say in this case. They would be really important also because bigger individuals are more have a higher reproductive capacity, so that would be a positive feedback. So this is a problem. We should fish less. So what are the alternatives? Because aquaculture is also sometimes not always very good for the environment. So I think it's time to think about alternatives and maybe take a step back in there. Aquaculture, I think most of the fish that I see in the market is aquaculture now. It's not actually caught in the Mediterranean because it's so over exploited. So Jack, do you have something to add? Do you have an opinion?
No. I have nothing to add to this. I agree.
Okay, so we are moving direction now and thinking about actions and what we can do. So Sandra is asking us, how much can individuals do about the problems that we've highlighted? And how much is it about corporations and policymakers? And if individual can play a key role, how do we do this and how do we increase awareness? And that's a really good question for you too, because you've been engaged with the news as well, and you're actually increasing awareness yourself over these problems.
Yeah. So I've been talking about this with some people because it's really frustrating. I feel the frustration myself as well as an individual. It's very difficult to contribute. For instance, I'm not able to buy an electrical car because of economical limitations, and I'm living in a first world country and I don't have a lot of financial problems. So sometimes it's hard to see as an individual how you can contribute, and it's easy to say that that maybe the responsibles are the politicians, but also we do vote the politicians, and we have some ways of pressuring them into certain actions. And I think that if we can really raise the awareness of this problem and raise it to a population level and put the right pressure on our politicians to promote sustainable energy, for instance, we can do a lot as individuals. So I think that is really important. And also politicians are individuals as well. Everybody has to chip in.
Jack, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So there is something you can do as an individual. As a scientist, individual scientist, you can also contribute. You can communicate it to your students. You can communicate it to the general public. But you always have to make a trade-off between are you going to do just doing the science, or are you going to be an activist? So I've decided not to be an activist. But some colleagues are much more active in the political arena. I will never do this. I will always remain an academic. I want to, if the answer is something which is uncomfortable, I will also mention it. But that's something which I do as a scientist. As a person being, yes, that's the same thing as yours, which is for all of us. Our daily decisions do matter if we do it, all of us. But it is very difficult because sometimes you really have to make sacrifices, and everybody makes different choices. And things are not easy. If you have a car, should you, which is 6-7 years old, should you keep it till it is 15-20 years old, or should you buy a Tesla if you can afford
if you have the money for it, if you have a tax.
No, but even then, it is, if you do a life cycle analysis, those questions are not that simple. Of course, if you really would make a good impression to the outside world, buy a Tesla or another electric car, and everybody thinks this person is doing well for the environment. But as long as we produce our electricity mainly by fossil fuels, and you are leaving an old car which was functioning well, and you have to make a new one, if you do the life cycle analysis, you better use your old car for years to come. So those things are very difficult, and we have to communicate it, and the people have to be informed about it. But just communicate to everybody what is going on with really facts, and so that people are not getting emotional and really look at what's happening and what we can do about it.
And also be realistic. Don't feel guilty all the time for not being able to. You're always able to do something.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a very important topic that we're studying more in behavioral sciences, behavioral economics as well, which is climate guilt. Big driver of actions, but also sometimes it makes it feel so overwhelming that maybe we stop doing what we're supposed to do. But Iris, we have another question for you. So you highlighted the rise in sea temperatures as having an important impact on the composition of the sea species. What are the potential implications beyond the ocean? So for example, in terms of global warming, but also in terms of the economic and social changes that will follow.
So I'm not such an expert in economic and social changes, but I can talk a little bit about the changes in caused by the temperature. So in this talk, I talk mainly about the changes in distributions of species, but it's not only distribution of species. A change in temperature also causes a change in respiration. So when the temperature is higher, for instance, in autotrophic systems like plants, like for instance in seagrasses. So since they're plants, they photosynthesize and they produce oxygen. But also at night when there's no light, they respire like us. So with increasing temperatures, this balance changes a little bit. The respiration usually goes up much faster with increasing temperatures than the oxygen production. So this would change the oxygenation of the oceans, and this is also a very negative effect of global warming. And as an implication beyond the ocean, I think if our oceans aren't healthy, planet Earth will have a hard time of staying healthy as well. So when we have, for instance, less oxygen in the ocean, this could also be bad for shellfish production and other commercial species. So it's kind of a chain of negative effects, I would say.
Great. So, Jack, I'm afraid you're going to have to be a politician for a day for the next couple of questions.
Yeah, I saw them.
If you both had the power to make something happen, which actions would you promote and which actions would you discourage?
Okay, so I would. I never thought about those things because I don't like. I'm happy with our democratic, sometimes chaotic societies. But a few things we could do. We could stop supporting the classical fossil fuel industry by subsidies. We can stop that. It will be a hard time for them and also for many people economically depending on it. But it will, if we raise the cost of gas and oil, we will get a more rapid shift. That's one thing I would, if I would be a dictator, I would do. But also would also clearly communicate that any change will imply that we have to make some choices which people don't like. If we want to have solar power and wind energy, which means we have to change the landscape, the cityscape, like solar panels on old monument. Do we want this? That's something. The same thing at sea. If we put the whole North Sea full with windmills, we cannot eat anymore the fish from the North Sea because there is no space for the. So all those things you have to communicate that clearly, and that's not happening. And so that's another thing. And we should also realize that if we going to solar energy, etc., we need a lot of special metals, like the rare earth elements, the cobalt, the lithium, which are sometimes coming from countries which have a political system which we are not in favor of. That's another thing which I would communicate. And but if I would be in power, I would really raise the taxes on CO2 and stop putting and subsidizing innovations which really lead to climate adaptation, mitigation, and carbon dioxide removal, because it is important that we do something.
Yes, I wouldn't like to be the dictator and feel the responsibility of like Jack says, because there are always negative sides to every choice, and it is not going to be easy. And I don't think there is a right way. There are several paths we can take, but every positive effect will also have some negative effects. Like for instance, the windmills and collisions with birds, sea life. Every positive sustainable energy has kind of negative effects as well. And then there's the problem with the metals. But we'll have to make those choices at some point. And I do agree that that the change should be much faster, and maybe not encouraging fossil fuels would definitely be a way. And maybe find some, also promote research into alternatives for fossil fuels, fuels maybe we haven't thought of at this moment. But it's going to be hard, yes.
And something that you would discourage, Iris, if you have anything.
Which I would discourage.
Cheap flights. Yeah, that's basically, if you look at it, it is cheaper to.
Yes, but this is easy for you
to
to say, who lives in the country where your family is. I do feel the hurt. I agree with you, and but it's hard. I live on an island in Mallorca, and for me to move, I have to use some kind of transport that does contaminate, and this kind of choices is hard. Maybe you can say, I'll skip the holidays, I'll just stay where I am, but certain type of movements are very hard to sacrifice, I think, for a lot of people, including me.
We can stop them at higher levels. It's okay. We can get a few VIPs who are taking way more flights than you, I think, and discourage that.
Yes, definitely. And I don't fly when I go on holiday usually, but I have to take the boat to get off the island. So no way around that.
So one thing that came to mind as we were talking about individual actions, there's a lot of discussion over changing diets, and a lot of it revolves around being vegan. But part of the research is highlighting that we are going to have so much more seaweed in the future, that potentially that's a way forward as well. Do you know anything about the research around this?
So seaweed potentially could use the increase in carbon dioxide to grow. And it's not actually counted in the blue carbon and the carbon offset schemes because it doesn't store carbon, because it usually grows on rocks or is very easily decomposed. So eating seaweed might be an option, but we would still generate waste as well by eating seaweed. So I'm actually not an expert, but it's an interesting thought that this might be a kind of a solution.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm going to go on with some of my questions as we wait for the floor. One important part which has been discussed both in policy making and in research, and that we haven't quite touched upon, is plastics and microplastics and the role of that on the ocean. Do we think that there's enough technology out there to reduce the importance of this? You know, there's many brands now that produce with partially recycled plastics, and it seems like we might be moving in a better direction. The US recently banned single-use plastics in a number of cases, but a lot of it still remains in other forms.
Yeah, no, plastics, yeah. Plastics has received a lot of attention in the last 10 years in marine plastics. There are some people which really think it is a big issue. Some others think it is not such a big issue in terms of science, scientifically. You should realize that a lot of the plastics enter really in the coastal domain and remains in the coastal domain. And there are pictures which really iconic pictures which you see, but those are not really representative for what's happening. The way to solve it is really at where it starts. We should recycle the plastics, and then we can do a much better job. So we, for instance, I'm living in the Netherlands, but we separate plastics, not everywhere, because also some of the processing companies, they separate it. But when I was in Princeton 3 years ago, there were really the different types of plastic you had to put in different containers. And that's the way to go for it, because there are so many different types of plastics, and if you put them all together, you cannot reuse them. Then you're making, you get a good feeling that you separate your plastics, but it has no use. And that's something which we can do a much better job, certainly in my country, but I think in most European countries, because you don't even see it in countries like Austria and Germany, where you have to separate into 3 or 4 different types of plastics, which should happen. And that's something which is easily implemented, just if the political willingness to it is doable. Just
and the individual commitment as well.
Yeah, that's of course. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one final question. Actually, I'm going to mix two because one I think is really hard and one is really easy. And then we can close the debate for today. So we talked about the oceans in the last 500 years. I'm not going to ask you a forecast for the next 500. That seems too hard, but let's say for the next 50. That's hard enough, but let's think about a good scenario. I agree with Iris and I agree with this talk that there's a lot going on and we should be hopeful. What does the ocean look like in 50 years in an hopeful scenario? And on a simpler note, and we can close with that, what is the place that you will let your students or the audience Google that would make them hopeful and happy about the oceans?
What always makes me happy is Googling coral reefs, but hopeful, it's a little bit different. So I think it's important to see if organisms and ecosystems will be able to adapt to the unprecedented rate of well, mostly warming that we'll see. We'll certainly see changes, probably not always for the best, but maybe sometimes if an ecosystem is resilient enough and has the capacity to adapt, it might not be as bad as we think at this moment.
Yeah, I agree with that. As scientists, we use a reductionistic way of looking at problems. And for instance, if you want to look at long-term effects, we are doing short-term experiments. And those are often exaggerating the problem a little bit. Like it is the speed, the rate at which communities can adapt, which is really important. Like the problems with the coral reefs now have in Australia, if the coral reefs would instantaneously be transformed in coral reefs which are always in the Red Sea, they could stand those heat waves, because in the Red Sea they have it always. So it is the adaptation potential is there, but the speed is not fast enough for the organisms. That's something which it used to be a word which you was not allowed to say in conservation biology, but assistant evolution, which is now a booming field, which was, I think if you would have said that 10 years ago at a conservation biology conference, you would need some assistant to leave the room, I think. But you can see it as a negative side, that we have to go to those tools, these type of approaches, but also the positive side, that humankind wants to do something about it and might be able to do something about it. With respect to a lot of the other things like sea level rise, continued global warming, CO2 uptake of the ocean, it will continue. Some things will remain for a very long time. Any model, say, if we would emit today 100 units of CO2, 8 or 9 of those units will still be in the atmosphere in 100,000 years. So some of the things we can never turn away in thousands of years, and we have to accept that. And that's something, it is illusionary to think that we can return to conditions which were there before we were perturbing the environment. So that's going how I think the ocean will look very similar, except for the coastal domain, where we will see loss of certain communities, some new communities, and a lot of human use, much more than we do now.
Right. We hope it's going to be more sustainable, though.
Yes.
Okay, I think we can close the talk. Thank you so much to both of you for your slide stacks, which are really, really informative, especially to people like me who love the ocean, but don't know nearly enough as what we're supposed to help it. Thank you for the discussion, to everyone who's asked questions, to Ignacio, and to everyone who put together this wonderful event. I think all of it will be recorded, so you can watch it all over again if you want to. And I think we can close this up and just have a wonderful weekend. And you know, you're welcome to Google anything about the oceans, I think.
So thank you very much for this really nice discussion. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it as well.